Hi guys, and welcome to this next video on superpowers. We are following the specification, which is topic 7. So we're up to kind of 7.3 really, and we're looking today at superpowers have influence over economic systems, how that happens. So we're just going to be looking at some of these organisations and how that gives some of these superpowers and emerging powers power, really. So you will have done quite a lot of these global groupings back in globalization because we looked at most of these. So we're just going to go over these again in the videos at the bottom under A level. I've got a couple of videos. I've got one on the IGOs generally, so it goes over all of these, and I talk about all of the these global groupings and their kind of pros and cons, etc. So if you want to check out in a bit more detail the pros and cons of these global groupings, just have a look at that video as well, because I'm not going to go over that in too much detail. So this part of the spec looks at how they have influence over economic systems, and basically the whole idea of this is that you have to be in one of these global groupings in order to kind of be at the table, to have the conversations that you need to get trade links, to get trade talks going, to be in the room with the other politicians from the other powerful countries in order to get your voice heard and your country out there in terms of getting that TNC investment, etc. So really it's about who is and who isn't a part of those groups, and as we'll come to see at the bottom, there's definitely a divide still between the haves and the have-nots. So some of these organisations, I'm just going to go through them briefly. I'm not going to go over the pros and cons. We've got the World Bank, okay, which we know gives loans to countries. So again, if you're a big investor in the World Bank, you're going to get a lot of money back. The IMF, the same, is involved in bailouts. We know that Greece was bailed out a decade or so ago through the European Union, etc., when its economy failed. The World Trade Organization, which looks at making trade fair. The WEF, which is the World Economic Forum, again, a forum for discussion of kind of trade deals and trade talks and things to do with climate change and things like that as well. The G7 and the G20, those global groupings that allow you to have conversations with other powerful nations in order to at some point perhaps have conversations about trade deals, etc. And then we've got the United Nations, not the United States, the United Nations Security Council, which again gives you, maybe not from an economic point of view, but definitely from a power point of view, gives you a foot at the table, etc. And the IPCC, which looks at climate change, etc. And obviously that's got to do with your economy, because your global emissions have quite an impact on that. So these are the global groupings that we need to look at. Do our emerging nations have any power or influence here? Do they or don't they? To what extent are they part of these global groupings? And therefore, does that help them with their economic systems, with their investments, with their TNCs, etc.? How does that help them develop from an economic point of view? Now, the economy really is the most important driving factor in being a superpower, because once you have that money, then you can start spending that on other things. So it's really, really important from an economic and from a power point of view that you get your foot in the door, if you see what I mean, from trying to get to the table that has those people that have those discussions helping your country's economy. So you need to be looking at which of your emerging nations of the BRICS and the USA and Europe, etc., where do they fit in terms of being part of this? Now, at the bottom we can see that overall there is a big kind of gap really between the people who are involved in these IGOs and those who aren't. So mostly it's the West who are involved, or with the founding members of some of these organisations like the World Bank and the IMF. I think in one of the second video we talked about the Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan, etc., at the end of the Second World War, where kind of the USA was integral in founding the World Bank and the IMF to loan money to Europe, after the Second World War. So that gives it huge amounts of power. WTO again, and the WEF, United States, heavily involved in these organisations. So the West really does have a bit of a monopoly. However, the East is catching up a little bit because we've got China and India, which are now obviously part of the G20 and part of these organisations, having more of a say and having more of an influence really as their economies grow and as their economies become more powerful. They've got a lot more influence now from an economic point of view. So they are moving into, and you know, their economies are growing and therefore their power is increasing. Now we've got a long gap therefore for other parts of the world when we get to the bottom here, and we've got sub-Saharan Africa and we've got parts of South America. So many of these countries are not members of these IGOs, and that's a huge that has a huge impact on the amount of power they have or don't have. So I've put this idea of core periphery. And in one of the other videos below, I've done another video on core periphery and the different theories. So please have a check of that, because it's the next thing in 7.3. Talks about development theory, dependency theory, modernization theory, etc. How these theories lead to power. So the most simple one is the core periphery model, which is obviously dependency theory. And we've got the core, which is the West, and we've got the periphery, which is, you know, the East and maybe sub-Saharan Africa, etc. So we've got that idea that we've got the West, which has got the means of the technology, etc., and the means to move into these places. And through colonial times, it would have taken those resources, etc. And now with the neo-colonialism with TNCs, it uses the labour. So we've got the West, which is the core, and then we've got the periphery, which is obviously provides us with labour, but also cheap, you know, raw materials and cheap labour, etc. So we've got that idea that these superpowers, these emergent powers, do have a varying amount of influence, which of the economic systems in the world, and how those economies and how those how that money's driven, etc. So we also need to just consider the idea of soft power here again, and how soft power in terms of TNCs and goods and labels, etc., how that has influence over economic systems. Because obviously some of those massive brands that we've got, those huge American sports brands and clothing brands, etc., media brands, Sky and Fox and all news channels, etc., they have a huge influence over economic systems, because they have huge amounts of people who buy into them, and therefore once you buy those products, you know, you're giving huge amounts of money to those corporations, etc., which are mostly you know, American or from the West. So that is our idea of how superpowers have influence over economic systems, and who does and who doesn't, who's allowed, you know, into those talks and who isn't, etc. So that is influence over economic systems.